Sometimes a letter from heaven can stop the most famous talk show in America. The cameras were rolling at the Ellen DeGeneres show studio in Burbank, and the energy was electric as always. Ellen bounced onto the stage in her signature style, wearing a crisp white button-down and dark jeans, her infectious smile lighting up the room. The audience of 300 was on their feet, dancing to the opening music, completely unaware that in just 20 minutes, their laughter would turn to tears. "Welcome, welcome everybody," Ellen called out, her voice carrying that perfect blend of warmth and excitement that had made her America's beloved daytime host for nearly 2 decades. The studio lights caught the sparkle in her eyes as she gestured to the crowd with those expressive hands that had become as famous as her voice. "We've got an amazing show today. We've got surprises, we've got dancing, and we've got some incredible people with incredible stories. But first, I want to bring out someone very special." Behind the scenes, producers were running through their usual pre-show checklist. Camera operators adjusted their angles, sound technicians monitored audio levels. It was Tuesday afternoon, just another taping. None of them knew they were about to witness something that would redefine what daytime television could be. Sitting in the green room, 28-year-old David Martinez fidgeted with a worn manila envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the careful handwriting on the front. "For Ellen DeGeneres, from Grandpa Eduardo." The envelope had been sitting on his nightstand for 3 months, ever since the funeral. 3 months since he'd promised his dying grandfather he would deliver this letter personally. The green room buzzed with typical pre-show energy. Other guests chatted nervously with production assistants. But David sat apart, lost in memory, the envelope heavy in his hands, like it contained his grandfather's very soul. David had grown up in his grandfather's small house in East Los Angeles, where the walls were covered with family photos, and the kitchen always smelled like Eduardo's famous tamales. Eduardo Martinez had raised him after David's parents died in a car accident when he was just 7 years old. For 20 years, it had been just the two of them against the world. Eduardo worked double shifts at a textile factory to put David through college. He never missed a parent-teacher conference, never missed a soccer game, never missed a chance to tell his grandson how proud he was. "You're going to change the world, mijo," Eduardo would say, ruffling David's hair as they sat watching TV together. Ellen's show was always their afternoon ritual. Eduardo would laugh at her jokes, clap during her dance segments, and beam with pride whenever she highlighted teachers like David. "That Ellen, she has a good heart," he'd always say. "She sees people, really sees them." But Alzheimer's had stolen Eduardo piece by piece, like a thief in the night, taking precious memories. The sharp, witty man who had taught David to fix cars and speak Spanish and dance salsa had slowly faded away. The disease was cruel in its randomness. Some days Eduardo would recognize David immediately, his eyes lighting up with familiar love. Other days he would stare at his grandson like a stranger, fear clouding his once warm brown eyes. The hardest part for David was watching his grandfather struggle with words that had once flowed like poetry. Eduardo, who had told elaborate bedtime stories and sang Mexican folk songs, would sit for hours trying to remember the Spanish word for love. Sometimes he would cry from frustration, apologizing for forgetting things that had once defined him. In his final months, Eduardo often didn't recognize David at all. The man who had been David's anchor, his compass, his home, had retreated so far inside himself that David felt like he was mourning someone who was still breathing. But there were moments, brief flashes of clarity, when the grandfather David loved would resurface like sun breaking through storm clouds. It was during one of these moments, just 2 weeks before Eduardo passed away, that he had pressed the envelope into David's hands. They were sitting in the hospital room, afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, when Eduardo suddenly gripped David's wrist with surprising strength. "David," he said, his voice suddenly clear and urgent. "My David, For the first time in months, Eduardo's eyes were fully present, fully aware. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the envelope, his hands shaking but determined. "Promise me, mijo," Eduardo had whispered, his eyes suddenly clear and focused, boring into David's soul with an intensity that took his breath away. "Take this to Ellen. She'll understand. She has a good heart. She sees people like we do." David had been confused. His grandfather had always loved watching Ellen's show. It was one of the few things that could still make him smile even in his darkest days. They would watch together every afternoon, Eduardo sometimes forgetting who Ellen was, but never forgetting that her presence brought him joy. But why Ellen? Why a letter? Eduardo couldn't explain further before the fog returned to his eyes, his moment of clarity fading like morning mist. But his grip on David's hand remained firm until David made the promise. "I'll take it to her, Grandpa, I promise." Those were the last coherent words Eduardo ever spoke to him. A production assistant appeared at David's side. "David, you're up in 30 seconds. You ready?" David nodded, though ready felt like the wrong word. He'd been carrying this weight for months, this promise that felt too big for his shoulders. As he stood and walked toward the studio entrance, he could hear Ellen's voice, warm and welcoming, as always. "Please welcome David Martinez," Ellen announced, and David stepped through the curtain into a world of bright lights and thunderous applause. He walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him after the dimmer green room. The audience was a sea of friendly faces, all smiling encouragingly. Ellen approached with that warm smile that had comforted millions of viewers over the years, her presence immediately calming despite the chaos of cameras and crew members bustling around the set. "Hi, David," Ellen said, giving him a quick hug that felt genuinely warm, not just for the cameras. The audience erupted in approving applause. "How are you doing? First time on TV?" I'm nervous," David admitted, his voice carrying clearly through his wireless microphone. The audience chuckled sympathetically, the sound washing over him like a warm wave. Ellen had a gift for making people feel at ease, for creating an instant sense of intimacy, even in front of hundreds of strangers. But David felt the weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket like it was made of lead. "Well, that's totally normal. I still get nervous sometimes," Ellen said, with a wink that made the audience laugh again. "Tell us a little about yourself. What do you do?" As they settled onto her famous blue couches, David took a deep breath. The studio felt enormous and intimate at the same time, Ellen's genuine interest making it feel like they were just two people having coffee despite the cameras capturing every word. David took a deep breath. "I'm from L.A., and I work as a teacher, but I'm here because of my grandfather, Eduardo. He passed away 3 months ago." Ellen's expression immediately shifted to one of gentle compassion. "I'm so sorry for your loss, David. Tell me about him." "He was everything to me," David said, his voice already starting to crack. "He raised me after my parents died. He was the strongest, funniest man I knew. But he had Alzheimer's, and watching him disappear was—" David paused, struggling to find words. The studio had grown quieter. Ellen leaned forward, giving David her full attention. This was what made her different from other hosts. When someone was in pain, everything else stopped mattering. "Before he died," David continued, "he gave me something. He made me promise to bring it here, to you." David reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. "He said you would understand." Ellen looked at the envelope, then back at David. The audience was completely silent now. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I don't know. He wrote it for you, but I've never opened it. He said, you have a good heart." Ellen took the envelope with gentle hands. She could see Eduardo's shaky handwriting on the front, and something about it made her throat tighten. "May I?" she asked, looking at David. David nodded, tears already forming in his eyes. Ellen carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, lined notebook paper like a child might use for homework. The handwriting was careful but unsteady, clearly written by someone fighting against a disease that was stealing his ability to form words. Some letters were traced over multiple times, as if Eduardo had struggled to make them legible. As Ellen began to read silently, her expression changed in real time. The cameras captured every micro-expression, the slight widening of her eyes as she took in the first few sentences, the way her eyebrows drew together with concentration and growing emotion, the moment when her hand came up to cover her mouth as the full impact of Eduardo's words hit her. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 people held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended entertainment. Even the camera operators, who had filmed thousands of hours of television, found themselves leaning forward, drawn into the intimacy of the moment. Ellen read the letter twice, then looked up at David with tears clearly visible in her eyes now. Her professional composure, built over decades of television, was crumbling in real time. "David," Ellen said, her voice thick with emotion, barely above a whisper, but picked up clearly by her microphone. "Your grandfather, he wrote this for you." "For me?" "But it says your name on it," David said, confusion evident in his voice. Ellen looked up at David, tears clearly visible in her eyes now, reflecting the studio lights like diamonds. She had to take a moment to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with the back of her hand. "He was smart, your grandfather. Very, very smart." She took a shaky breath, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "He knew that if he gave this to you directly, it might be too hard to read. The grief might make it impossible to really hear his words. But if he asked you to bring it to someone else, someone you trusted to deliver his message with love." The audience was holding its collective breath. You could have heard a pin drop in the massive studio. Ellen looked down at the letter again. "David, your grandfather wrote about how proud he is of you, how even when his mind was failing, when he couldn't remember your face or his own name, the one thing that never faded was his love for you. He says—" Ellen's voice broke completely. She had to stop and wipe her eyes. The cameras captured every moment, Ellen's tears, David's stunned expression, the absolute silence in a studio that was usually filled with laughter. "He says he was worried that as his disease progressed, he might forget to tell you how much you mean to him. So he wrote it down, every feeling, every memory he was afraid of losing. And he sent you here because he knew I would make sure you heard it." David was crying openly now. "He never forgot me?" Ellen shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Never. Not once. Listen to this." She began reading from the letter, her voice steady despite her tears. "My David has grown into a man I am so proud of. When his parents died, I was scared I wouldn't know how to raise him. But he taught me how to be a father. Every day with him was a gift. If I forget his face, if I forget his name, if I forget everything else, I will never forget that loving him was the best thing I ever did." The studio erupted not in applause, but in the sound of 300 people crying together. Ellen set the letter down and moved to sit next to David on the couch. Without saying anything, she pulled him into a hug. Not a quick TV hug, but the kind of embrace that acknowledges profound loss and celebrates enduring love. "Your grandfather made sure his love would outlive his memory," Ellen whispered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "That's not just smart, David. That's eternal." When they finally pulled apart, Ellen looked directly into the camera. "Eduardo Martinez taught us something today. Love doesn't require a perfect memory. Love doesn't require a clear mind. Love just requires a heart that refuses to give up." She turned back to David. "Your grandfather is still teaching, still taking care of you. That letter? That's him making sure you never doubt how much you were loved." The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove the long moments of silence, the tears, or the raw emotion. It became one of the most watched Ellen Show episodes in history, not because of celebrity guests or funny sketches, but because viewers witnessed something authentic in a world that often feels manufactured. Within hours of airing, A Letter from Grandpa trended worldwide as viewers shared their own stories of love transcending memory loss. 6 months later, David returned to the show, not as a guest, but as part of Ellen's audience. He brought with him a framed photo of Eduardo and himself, taken just days before his grandfather's death. In the photo, Eduardo is smiling, his eyes clear for one precious moment. Ellen spotted David in the audience and immediately called him up again. This time, when he walked onto the stage, he carried himself differently. The crushing weight of grief had been replaced by something lighter, but no less powerful. Gratitude mixed with purpose. "How are you doing?" Ellen asked. "Better," David said simply. "Much better? I read the letter every day. It's like having him back, having his voice in my head again." What would you tell other people who are watching someone they love disappear to Alzheimer's? David thought for a moment. Don't wait for perfect moments to say how you feel. Say it now, while they can still hear you. And if they can't remember your words, live in a way that shows them every day. Love doesn't require memory to be real. Ellen wiped her eyes. Your grandfather would be so proud. He is proud, David corrected gently. Love like that doesn't die. It just changes address. The letter still sits framed on David's kitchen table next to a photo of him and Eduardo dancing at David's college graduation. Every morning, David reads it with his coffee. Every evening, he tells his grandfather about his day. David went on to start a support group for families dealing with Alzheimer's, using Eduardo's letter as inspiration for encouraging people to write messages to their loved ones while they still can. Because Eduardo Martinez was right about Ellen DeGeneres, she does have a good heart. And sometimes that's exactly what you need to deliver love across the impossible distance between life and death. Sometimes it takes a letter from heaven, delivered by the most unlikely messenger, to remind us that the heart remembers what the mind forgets. And sometimes the most powerful gift you can give someone isn't your presence, but the promise that your love will find a way to reach them, even when you can't.